There are some people who never touched your life with violence, but somehow, every time they entered the room, your nervous system tightened. You smiled around them. You answered their messages. You stayed kind. You tried to understand them. And yet, after every conversation, something inside you felt drained. Not dramatic, not obvious, just different. Your peace changed around them. And what hurts the most is that you kept blaming yourself for it. You thought maybe you were becoming too sensitive, too distant, too cold, too difficult to love. But deep down, there was another feeling you couldn't explain. A quiet discomfort, a heaviness that arrived before they even spoke, a strange exhaustion that followed you long after they left. And maybe that feeling wasn't anxiety. Maybe it was awareness. Because sometimes God does not expose people through chaos. Sometimes He exposes them through the disappearance of your peace. That is what makes this so confusing. Not every harmful connection looks harmful in the beginning. Some people arrive wrapped in familiarity. Some arrive with charm. Some arrive with wounds that awaken your compassion. And some arrive speaking the English, ECT language. Your lonely heart has been waiting to hear. But eventually, your spirit notices what your emotions are trying to ignore. And that is when everything starts changing inside you. You begin second-guessing your calm. You over-explain yourself more than usual. You rehearse conversations in your head after they end. You feel emotionally tired after being around them, even if nothing bad technically happened. And the strangest part, you cannot fully explain why. Because peace does not always leave loudly. Sometimes it slips away quietly, little by little, until you barely recognize yourself anymore. There are people who can stand beside you while secretly disconnecting you from yourself. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but deeply. Some people carry unresolved chaos that slowly becomes emotional weather around everyone close to them. And if your heart is naturally empathetic, if you are someone who absorbs emotional atmospheres deeply, you will start carrying storms that never belonged to you. That is why your body noticed before your mind did. Because the soul recognizes what the eyes are still trying to romanticize. You kept trying to make the connection. Makes sense. You kept looking at their potential, their pain, their good moments, their apologies, their rare softness. But peace is not measured by occasional tenderness. A connection should not require you to abandon yourself just to preserve it. And some of the hardest people to walk away from are the ones who never gave you enough pain to justify leaving, but never gave you enough peace to truly stay. That kind of confusion can trap someone for years. Because when damage is subtle, you begin debating your own instincts. You tell yourself, they mean well. They've been through a lot. Maybe I'm overthinking. Not meanwhile, your spirit keeps whispering. But why do you feel so heavy after every interaction? God often speaks through contrast. That is something people rarely talk about. Sometimes clarity does not come through a voice. It comes through a feeling. You suddenly notice how peaceful you are when certain people are absent. You notice how deeply you breathe when you are alone again. How your thoughts become quieter. How your body finally relaxes. And in that silence, you realize you were surviving someone you kept calling home. There are relationships slowly train you to abandon your inner calm in exchange for emotional unpredictability. You become hyper alert, emotionally cautious, afraid of saying the wrong thing, afraid of triggering distance, afraid of losing connection. So you shape-shift, you soften your truth, you minimize your needs, you become emotionally smaller just to keep the atmosphere stable. But real connection does not require self-erasure. And eventually, God allows your peace to change around certain people because your soul can no longer afford the cost of pretending. That discomfort you felt? It was not weakness. It was discernment trying to wake you up gently. Not everything toxic feels toxic immediately. Some things feel emotionally addictive first. That is why letting go becomes complicated. Because you are not only attached to who the person is, you are attached to who you hope they would become. And hope can keep people emotionally imprisoned far longer than pain ever could. You wait for consistency, for healing, for honesty. for the version of them that only appears in rare moments. Meanwhile, your nervous system lives in survival mode. You start normalizing emotional instability because the peaceful moments feel rewarding enough to stay. But peace should not feel rare around someone who truly values your spirit. Read that again internally. Peace should not feel rare. There is a reason your soul kept growing quiet around them. There is a reason you stopped feeling emotionally safe enough to fully exhale. There is a reason your joy became smaller in their presence. And maybe the hardest truth is this: you were trying to receive emotional nourishment from someone who was emotionally unavailable to themselves. People who are disconnected internally often create confusion externally, not because they are evil, but because unhealed people unintentionally transfer inner chaos onto those closest to them. And compassionate people suffer the most in those dynamics because they keep trying to understand instead of protect themselves. You saw their wounds and called it depth. You saw inconsistency and called it complexity. You saw emotional distance and called it fear of intimacy. But eventually, God lets exhaustion become louder than attachment. Because sometimes exhaustion is the final warning before your soul disappears inside a connection. That is why your peace changed. Not to punish you, to protect you. Some people cannot walk with you into the season God is preparing for you because your spirit would keep shrinking to survive them. And deep inside, you already knew that. That is why you kept feeling torn between love and relief. One part of you missed them. Another part of you felt safer away from them. That emotional contradiction can break a person quietly, especially when you genuinely cared, especially when you wanted the connection to work, especially when you prayed over it, waited for it, excused it, protected it from other people's opinions. But eventually, truth becomes impossible to silence. Not dramatic truth, not explosive truth, peaceful truth, the kind that arrives slowly at 2 a.m., the kind that reaches you during silence, the kind that finally says, you are not becoming harder to love, you are becoming harder to drain. Dawned, that realization changes everything. Because for so long you interpreted your discomfort as guilt, but maybe your soul was simply exhausted from betraying itself. There is a sacred difference between being loving and being available for emotional harm. And many people were neither taught that difference. Some were taught that endurance equals loyalty, that self-sacrifice equals love, that constantly forgiving without boundaries makes you spiritually mature. But even Jesus withdrew from certain environments. Even peace needs protection. And maybe God was not hardening your heart around them. Maybe He was returning you to yourself. That process often feels lonely at first, because when your spirit begins waking up, you start noticing things you used to ignore. You notice who only calls when they need emotional rescue. You notice who drains every room with negativity. You notice who subtly competes with your growth. You notice who becomes uncomfortable when you become healthier. And suddenly conversations that once felt normal start feeling heavy. Not because you hate them, not because you think you are better than them, but because your spirit is no longer willing to normalize what once wounded it. Growth changes your emotional tolerance. And when peace becomes your priority, certain energies stop feeling familiar. That is why some people call you distant after you heal. They were connected to the version of you that overextended itself. T version that ignored red flags. The version that abandoned boundaries to avoid disappointing people. The version that kept choosing emotional chaos because it felt familiar. But healing creates distance between you and environments that once fed on your confusion. And that distance can feel terrifying. Because peace is unfamiliar when you spend years surviving instability. At first, calm feels empty. Silence feels suspicious. Consistency feels strange. You almost miss the emotional turbulence because your nervous system became addicted to unpredictability. That is how deeply some connections affect people. Not just emotionally, physically. You stop sleeping well. You overthink constantly. Your body stays tense. Your intuition becomes clouded. And the saddest part is that you often do not realize how emotionally overwhelmed you were until you finally step away. Then suddenly your mind becomes quieter. Your creativity returns. Your laughter feels natural again. You stop carrying invisible emotional weight all day, and you realize something painful. You were not losing yourself randomly. You were losing yourself gradually around the wrong energy. That realization here, at ease, because it forces you to grieve more than the person. You grieve the version of yourself that kept begging for peace while still choosing what disrupted it. But do not shame yourself for that. Humans are emotionally hopeful creatures. We stay because we remember beautiful moments. We stay because we believe people can change. We stay because connection is sacred to us. And sometimes we stay because loneliness feels heavier than confusion. But eventually God begins separating you from what keeps interrupting your inner stillness. Not always through dramatic endings, sometimes through emotional clarity. You simply wake up one day and realize your soul has been whispering enough for a very long time. And what once felt emotionally irresistible now feels emotionally expensive. That shift is sacred because peace is not laziness. Peace is alignment. When something constantly disconnects you from your calm, from your identity, from your emotional stability, your spirit eventually reacts. And that reaction is not weakness. It is wisdom. Some people think discernment always arrives as certainty, but often it arrives as exhaustion. You become tired in places where why? You used to force yourself to stay. Tired of over-explaining. Tired of emotional inconsistency. Tired of carrying relationships alone. Tired of feeling unseen while giving everything. And eventually your soul stops negotiating with what your body already knows. That is when boundaries stop feeling cruel. That is when silence becomes healing instead of lonely. That is when distance becomes mercy. Because not everyone you love is healthy for your spirit. And admitting that can feel heartbreaking, especially if they were part of important memories, especially if they once comforted you, especially if you still see goodness in them. But goodness alone does not create safety, and your spirit deserves safety too. Some people only know how to connect through dysfunction, through emotional dependency, through instability, through guilt, through inconsistency. So when you become healthier, they experience your boundaries as rejection. But protecting your peace is not rejection. It is responsibility. There are seasons where God removes confusion by removing your desire to keep tolerating it. You stop chasing. You stop forcing conversations. You stop trying to rescue what keeps exhausting you. And slowly, you begin hearing yourself again. That may be one of the holiest experiences a person can have, to hear themselves again, to sit in silence without anxiety, to wake up without emotional heaviness, to stop carrying someone else's chaos inside your chest. That kind of peace changes people, not loudly, quietly. You become softer, more present, more emotionally honest. You stop performing strength and start living from truth. And strangely enough, the more peace returns to your life, the more clearly you understand why it disappeared around certain people in the first place. Your spirit was reacting to misalignment, not perfection, not superiority, misalignment. Some people are simply not meant to walk closely beside the person you are becoming, and forcing closeness with them only delays your healing. That does not mean you hate them. Sometimes love means releasing people before resentment destroys what compassion remains. Sometimes distance is the most loving thing possible, because constant emotional friction changes people internally. It makes them anxious, defensive, disconnected from themselves. And God did not create your spirit to be live in permanent emotional survival. You were created to experience stillness too. Real stillness, the kind where your heart no longer feels like it is bracing for disappointment. The kind where your nervous system is not preparing for emotional unpredictability every day. The kind where you can finally exist without constantly monitoring another person's moods. That peace is sacred. Do not ignore it again once you find it. Because there are people who will call your boundaries selfish simply because they benefited from your lack of them. There are people who felt most comfortable with you when you were emotionally exhausted and easy to access. But the healed version of you moves differently, not colder, clearer. You stop trying to save connections that only survive through your over-effort. You stop abandoning yourself just to avoid losing others. And little by little, your inner world becomes quieter, healthier, more honest. You begin noticing beauty again, tiny moments, morning silence, breathing deeply, laughing without tension, feeling emotionally safe in your own company. That is how restoration begins. Not through dramatic miracles, through the return of peace. And maybe that is why this message found you today. Not to make you fearful of people, not to make you isolate yourself, but to remind you that your spirit matters too. Your emotional safety matters too. Your peace is not a small thing. It is sacred guidance. Sometimes God protects you by making your soul uncomfortable before your life completely falls apart. Sometimes the warning arrives as emotional exhaustion, as heaviness, as quiet internal resistance you cannot explain logically. And if you have been feeling that lately, if certain people suddenly feel emotionally heavier than before, if your spirit has been craving distance, silence, or solitude, maybe your soul is trying to return home to itself. Maybe God is gently pulling you away from what no longer aligns with your healing. Not because you are unlovable, but because you have spent too long calling survival love down. And now your spirit wants something different, something calmer, something honest, something that does not require you to abandon your inner peace just to keep it alive. That longing inside you is not weakness, it is awakening. And one day, you will look back and realize the loss of peace. Peace was never random, it was guidance. Your soul was trying to lead you somewhere healthier long before your mind understood. And maybe for the first time in a long time, you do not need to force clarity anymore. You only need to pay attention to what your peace has been trying to tell you all along.